Greetings, Acolytes. Rodney Anonymous from 7th Victim. And look, we're in the real world this time. If you saw the last video, you noticed that 99.99999% of it took place inside the box. It took place inside my desktop, and that's because I was showing you how I sketch out ideas within FL Studio, and then eventually I bring them over to the hardware. That's what today is all about. So that's why today we're coming to you in 3D. Ooh, Dr. Tung's 3D House of Stewardess Chicks. Woo! Look at those stewardess chicks, kids. Ooh, Count Floyd doesn't usually do this, but let's see some more stewardess chicks. All right, enough silliness. You're here to learn. And before I can show you how everything makes it from the software over to the hardware, what I have to do is give you a quick history lesson, and then you'll get a tour of this lovely equipment. History lesson. If we were to go back in time 30 years ago, I would have hair. That's a beautiful thing. I'd be a lot thinner. And I would live in a tiny little apartment. It was all my studio. And crammed into that tiny little apartment was what was an Alesis MMT8. And the Alesis MMT8 was my sequencer. And that took care of taking all the different parts from things and putting them together. It was the brains of the system. And it was great because it looked like a piece of 1980s office equipment. It looked like an adding machine. It was gray. It was beautiful in that sense, utilitarian. And I also had a Yamaha DX11, and you could put that in the performance mode. And what that meant was you could say, okay, this will be the bass, and the bass will be on MIDI channel 1. This is the lead, and the lead will be on MIDI channel 2, pads on MIDI channel 3. And the great thing with working with the Alesis MMT8 was that you could do polyphony. So you could play whole chords, and it understood what you were doing. Riding along with that system to handle the drums was the Alesis HR16. Beautiful drum machine, fantastic. In fact, I've taken some of the sounds from it and put it into my new set of drums. Great. Also, what they did was, I've taken some of these, they created as its buddy a little bit later, the HR16B, cleverly named, and it was all black and it came with industrial sounds, and it was beautiful. Okay, that's your history lesson. Now let's take a look at what we're using over here, what we call le hardware, or in Mexico, it would be el hardware or something. Okay, let me just hang on. Let me move this snake. These things go all over the place. All right, as previously mentioned, this is the brains of the system. This is the Arturio BeatStep Pro. It's basically 3 sequencers in one. Three sequencers in one. Bottom sequencer right here handles all your drum parts, so you can hear that. Lovely. Those aren't coming from the sequencer. I'll show you where those are coming from. Sequencer number 2, I use this to handle the sounds from the Ormsby. And I'll show you the Ormsby in a minute, but those are all those creepy sounds that I tend to use. Really make 7th Victim 7th Victim. I tend to make those custom, stay up late at night working on those. And the top sequencer here handles the bass. And that is from the Volca bass, and I'll show you that also in a minute. Okay, let's get moving over here. Beginning, hang on, gotta move another snake. All right, handling the drum section. This is the Volca sample, and I'm not using any of the Volca drum machines. They're fine. Volca Beats is okay. Some people don't like the snare. There's a Volca kick. I believe there's a new Volca drum out. I actually like this because the low end on this is amazing. You can there are the knobs right there. You can have a lot of fun with that. And people tend to say nice things about the low end at our shows. Also, 7th Victim is a band that likes you to dance. So low end is very important to us. And you'll see the other piece of our rhythm section in a few minutes. The only problem I have is, if you look down here, you'll see the drums are numbered. And we talked about the HR16 earlier, my old drum machine. And it was called the 16 because it had 16 drum sounds. This goes from 1 to 16. However, we only have drum sounds up to 10. So there's 10, and we go to 11. No drum sound. That's 10 you're hearing. There we go. No drum sound. And that's because those are used for songs. In other words, you take different patterns, and I understand that in the last video, some people notice I pronounce pattern as pattern and often say business. It's a regional Southwest Pennsylvania thing. It could be worse. I'll try not to do it because I know it's annoying. I would love to have all 16 sounds, because then I could use all 16 sounds, obviously, for 16 drum sounds. This does limit me a bit, but I'm trying to do that whole creativity through limitation thing. And I guess if I had all 16 sounds, I'd probably fill it up with all sorts of weird things from my pocket operator, which Dean Clean kindly gave me. And so they'd probably be all clicky and annoying. And I can add those later on anyway. But that's just so you know, I've really got, that's a tiny little complaint. Normally I've got no complaints with the way the Volca sample sounds. There's a Volca sample out there somewhere. You can probably get it super cheap with sounds in it from the band OK or OK Go. That's the name of the band. And it looks very silly. And when we first saw it, everybody went, "Go home, Korg. You're drunk." All right, moving over here. Going to move another snake. Not an actual, doesn't make a sound, but this is a Vixen Mixer. This is what I use to run everything into live and here at home. I guess I'm live at home. I don't know how many of these they made or if they're still making them. I know the guy was a bit of a nightmare for him. I was lucky. I got in early, and this is before number 100. I had about a year wait for it, but it was worth the wait. Really fantastic. Use it live. It's wonderful. I haven't had a problem with it at all. So if you can get your hands on one, I do recommend them. All right, going snakes again. All right, ooh, snake made a sound. This is what we call the Ormsby. Its actually official name is the Volca FM. As I mentioned before, I used to have a Yamaha DX11, which is the little brother of the DX7. This recreates a DX7. And what happens is I tend to create my own sounds. I love programming FM synth, so I get fairly unusual sounds. Sometimes I give them kind of lame names. This is just called Fantasy Orchestra. I should have been more creative than that, but do like the sound of that, and I've got a bunch of stuff in here, so if I go and I just twiddle this knob, you can hear, and let me find something annoying here. Here we go. Yeah, that's the sound in the beginning of Dance to the Names of Snakes, the one that everybody loves so much. All right, and if you saw the last video, when I showed you that Dext, the sounds that I have in Dext, they eventually come over here to this. I move them through the computer in much the same way I'm going to be moving some thoughts around, some songs around. So, and oftentimes they sound different on the computer than here. That's when I learned that, and I began to learn, hey, wait a minute, the hardware, not always the same. Now, we talked about the fact that these are monophonic. If I didn't mention it, I'm mentioning it now. Each of these sounds is monophonic. So what I do is I go in here, I add a little chorusing to these, and I put them in a unison mode. What happens is unison will take like, you know, a low C, a high C, a mid C, combine them all into a C, and it sounds nice and thick. So that's why I do that. And it's really changed the way I write. So I'll show you what I do if I need to do chords later on in a minute or two. But now we're going to talk about, oh wait, we're going to move another snake. We're going to talk about the Volca bass. Now, the Volca bass, I used to have another bass. You can see it over here. It's my good friend Stephen Archer gave me. And it was fantastic, but the problem was in order to get it to go out in different MIDI channels, you had to go in the back and click it. Sounds great, and I often use it when recording in combination with the Volca bass. The reason I got the Volca bass is a friend of mine was writing on Facebook about how he'd wanted something for Christmas, didn't get it, and so he was going to buy himself one. And to be nice, I said, oh yeah, I wanted a Volca bass. And I didn't really, but I just wanted him to feel better. And then Vienna went out and got me this, and I am actually very, very glad she did. She's helped contribute to the sound of Seventh Victim. The Volca bass is essentially the engine from a Mini Korg 700S. I used to own one of those. Being a moron in the early 90s, early to mid 90s, when everybody was going over to hardware, what I did was I went down to the pawn shop and I pawned my Mini Korg 700S for about $25. So I was really glad when I got one of these, and then I started, you know, it arrived and said, oh, I got you one, like, look what I got you for Christmas. And then I was like, whoa. So if you're a fan of early synth punk, like The Normal or OMD, everybody, I think early Human League, everybody had the Mini Korg 700S. This sounds like it. It's great for bass. I actually use it for lead on a couple songs, and I'll have the Ormsby play like a digital bass. I can't say enough good things about it. All right, moving over here, this is the controller. This is the controller I use. It is an Akai MPK Mini. I use these pads here usually. Well, we used to fire the samples before I started putting the samples on the Akai app on my phone. But the right now I've got set up for the lead for this song. But just want to bring this up. This may be going. I may be replacing this with an UNISON, with the Arturio Mini Freak, maybe something along those lines, just because I'm kind of looking forward to getting rid of the laptop that I use live. It's just one less thing to carry around, one less thing you have to worry about. It's still the same number of inputs and probably the same number of plugs, unless I go with the UNISON, which is battery powered, but I digress. Right. Speaking of the laptop, we're now going to finally talk about how the songs get moving more snakes. Woo, 3D House of Tortoise Snakes. We're going to talk about how the sounds get from area A, which is the desktop, over to the brains of the system, which is the BeatStep Pro. Now, Arturia have a program, and that program is called the Midi Control Center. So right now, all you techie types are probably listening and going, oh, I see, you just create a MIDI file over on your desktop, and then you put it in here, or you can go right from the desktop, and you just put that into the BeatStep Pro. Not so much. What happens is this doesn't import MIDI files. So Arturia, if you're listening, anyone at Arturia or anybody out there who knows a way to do this, could save me a lot of time, please find a way that I can just import the MIDI files. It would, large chunks of my life would be freed up, and that would be fantastic. So please, again, I love your products. Don't get me wrong. Just we really need to find a way to do that. All right, so what I have to do is then I usually go in and I enter all the notes by hand. It takes a bit of time. There are some features that allow you to copy and paste. Those are helpful. And one thing I like about entering everything by hand, it allows me to screw up every now and then. And sometimes when I screw up, that makes things more interesting. So in this case, what you're looking at, each of the sequences, this is sequence 1. You remember sequence 1. Sequence 1. Bass sounds. Sequence 2 over here. Now each of the sequences are broken up into, the song you can put up to 16 patterns in them. And I tend to use nearly all 16 when I write a song. I'll explain that in a minute. This is sequence number 2, or sequencer 2. That is, of course, our friend the Ormsby. But I didn't explain it already. It's called the Ormsby because it's named after Alan Ormsby. And I actually have a song, a sound on here somewhere called the Ormsby. Here we go. And that sounds like the music in the background of Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. So that is why that is called the Ormsby. Think about calling the next 7 Victim album the Ormsby. All right, so back to this. You create each one. In this case, just took the bass sound, moved it up 2. We talked up 2 octaves. We talked about that in the last video, and so you can go back. You can look at that to understand what I'm doing. Here's the drum pattern. Normally I just play these in, but I think I added this one because I was in here doing so much anyway. All right. Now that is how that works. Not necessarily a bad thing, but when you're working out and you're adding 16 parts, you can see these things become kind of complicated. So I have some of them are sort of the same thing, but with drum rolls in there. Again, I'll explain. But you can see, put it in there and you copy it out. Now, I'm going to step back and I'm going to show you something. Okay, having all these patterns and different ideas. Okay, this one's just like this one, but it's got a little drum break in there. I'll explain that. It can get a little complicated. What you want to do, you want to have one of these. Doesn't necessarily have to be a spell book, but it should be a notebook. You're going to see my childlike handwriting. The reason it's super childlike with all these scribbly things all over it is because I just scribble everything down and then I put it neatly into Word later on. But I have to keep a track of it. So basically this is saying, okay, 01, sequence 01, that's 4 bars, and that's bass drums and the FM synth, and that's going to be used for the pre-choruses, the choruses, and then there's something in here like, okay, 02, 4 bars, that's just the bass, that's the bass drum and the FM synth, but that's used for the break part, that's the B minor part. If you saw the other video, you can see where I scribbled out, and I thought, well, no, this is when you actually take a song. I promise we'll get to all this. This is when you take a song and you put all the pieces together. So I'll show you that too. So just the important thing is, if you're going to do this, have a notebook. It can be a super scary spell book. That's awesome too. But you want to do that. I'm looking off camera because I can see what I wanted to talk about next. Okay, so now you've got all the little parts created within the software, and you brought them down to the computer. It's just a simple send button thing. And what I do is, like I say, I put these in bit by bit. I'll throw in the bass and everything, give a listen. So here would be like the drum pattern that begins it. Now I'm going to play over here. You're going to hear a sound, just so you get an idea of what it'll be like. There'll be a lead or pad, and then what I often have to do is, and let me just find one here that is not, I think this should do it. Yeah, there's no drum break in there. I'm going to add one. What they have is, there's a nice feature here. I like to add a little drum weirdness every 4 bars, and then before transition, a bit more drum weirdness. So what I can do is, if I use a little drum weirdness, I tend to do that with the kick drum, and you can use this lovely roller that they have here to do this. So it would be something along these lines. Although usually not that dramatic. And if you wanted to do a snare, you could do something like this. And you can play with that all day. Now, when you've got the different bits, you're going to have to chain these together. And the way that is done, and it's a bit painful, is you hold down the sequence and then shift. Keep the sequence part held down. You can let up shift, and then you would go through the number. So if your song, it goes with, with step, or whatever you want to call pattern 3, and then pattern 6, and then pattern 3, and then pattern 8, and then you would enter those, and you would do that for each of these. So that can be time consuming. That's why you want to have the notebook. Write it all down in the notebook. Look at the notebook as you enter all of this. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now that it's all entered and I've got my my sound ready, I can play along with it. I can get it over to Janet, and we can start discussing lyrics, kick that back and forth via email. Eventually you'll see a video where Janet comes over and sings, and then you can hear the whole finished song with Janet on it, and we should be releasing it around that time. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to let you hear it and then say, catch you in a couple months. Okay, a couple questions you're going to ask is, well, how does the song get over to Janet? Do you just open the window and play it very loudly? No. What I have over here, I'm going to show you this. My good friend Dean Clean, the same guy, drummer for the Dead Milkmen, same guy who got me the pocket operator, was at a flea market, and he saw this. And he said, you'll use this for something. And Dean is always right. I don't want to admit that on camera, but I just did. What I do is, in here is where I keep my equipment for taking this music and running it back into the computer so I can send it over to Janet. What we have here, these go into the Vixen Mixer, the out. They connect into this nice little Newmark. And I've tried everything. This actually sounds the best. My box closed. Thank you, thing. And then this runs out of the Newmark into the desktop. Now, why? That's the question you're asking. Why not just record each bit individually? You're probably asking, and then you'll be able to mess with each track. You're probably wondering why I just don't lay down a MIDI part as a MIDI out, run out to each part, bring it back. The truth is, I was watching a video, and I know I hate to do this. Let me put this down for a second, but I have to do this. Link in the comments section. I saw a video about this guy in England who had recreated a studio just like the 1950s, and which doesn't sound exciting, but it was, because he had one mic and people had to work out what they were going to sound like, and the sort of mix for going live, and it really sounded immediate, and it does. This sounds a lot more immediate. Maybe it's just in my ears, but I'm happy with it that way for my ears when I do it that way. So I get it mixed up here, I get the mix here, and then I say, all right, I'm ready, and then I do the stuff I just showed you, and that goes over into the computer. So what I'll do is, I'll generally just play into this. So, oh, that's weird. There we go. Generally just sort of play into it live. So this would begin with something like this. And that's what we talked about before, the low part here. And then there'll be a little transition here. And you get the idea. Alright, so What I'm going to do now, I have that. I moved it over. Now, after I move it over, I'll give it a listen. And then what I do is, there's usually something I want to change, and that happens a lot. In this case, I shot one over, gave it a listen, decided that the end part should have a snare removed that didn't quite work, and that there should be a transition between what I call a hollow verse and the actual verses. All right, so what you'll hear next will be the finished version of this, or the not finished version. Janet has to work with it. So you'll hear what it sounds like from the hardware, and you can compare that to the last video. So hopefully in the next video, I know Janet much more popular than I am. I am not the star of my own solo project. I'm well aware of that. So hopefully in the next one, maybe we'll have Janet singing. Janet and I will talk about the lyrical content and all that. In the meantime, again, thank you for sticking with these, because I greatly appreciate it, and I do hope you learned something. All right, have a good whatever.